The night had that strange, heavy stillness that only comes in the Midwest, just before winter settles in. The kind of stillness where the air feels too cold to move, and the streetlights glow a little too softly, as if the world is holding its breath. Archer Avenue stretched out in a long, lonely ribbon of asphalt, cutting through the dark like a forgotten road in a dream. Cars passed only occasionally, their headlights sweeping across the empty fields and the bare trees that lined the cemetery walls. It was on one of those nights, the kind where the silence feels older than the road itself, that the first sighting happened. A man named Daniel was driving home from a late shift, his eyes heavy, his mind drifting. He'd taken Archer Avenue 1,000 times, never thinking twice about the stories people whispered about it. Ghost stories? He thought. Urban legends. Things teenagers told each other to make the long drive feel dangerous. But then he saw her. A girl in a pale dress, standing on the side of the road with her arms wrapped around herself, as if she were freezing. Her hair was long and blonde, falling over her shoulders in soft waves. She looked no older than 20. Her dress shimmered faintly in the headlights, not sequined, not metallic, just luminous, like moonlight caught in fabric. Daniel slowed the car, instinctively rolling down the window. "Are you all right?" he called out. The girl didn't answer. She simply lifted her head, revealing eyes that were startlingly blue, too bright, too clear, as if they belonged to someone who had never known exhaustion or age. She stepped closer to the car, her movements smooth and strangely graceful, and Daniel felt a chill crawl up his spine. "Do you need a ride?" he asked. She nodded once, slowly, and opened the passenger door. Her dress rustled softly as she slid into the seat, folding her hands in her lap. She didn't look at him. She didn't look at anything. She just stared straight ahead, her expression calm, almost serene. Daniel tried to make conversation, asked where she was headed, if she was okay, if she needed to call someone, but she didn't respond. She only spoke once, her voice soft and distant, like someone talking in their sleep. North. He drove in silence, the road stretching endlessly before them. The girl's presence filled the car with a strange coldness, not uncomfortable, but unnatural, like the air inside the vehicle didn't belong to the same night outside. When they passed the gates of Resurrection Cemetery, she stirred for the first time, turning her head slightly toward the iron bars. "She," whispered. Daniel pulled over, confused. The girl reached for the door handle, her fingers pale and delicate. She stepped out of the car without looking back. Daniel leaned over the passenger seat, watching as she walked toward the cemetery gates, and then she vanished. Not slowly. Not dramatically. One moment she was there, her pale dress glowing faintly in the moonlight, and the next, the space she occupied was empty. Daniel sat frozen, his breath caught in his throat. The cold inside the car lifted instantly, replaced by the normal warmth of the heater. He stared at the cemetery gates for a long time, half expecting her to reappear. She didn't. He drove home in silence. The image of her pale dress burned into his mind. He didn't tell anyone what he'd seen. Not at first, but he wasn't the only one. A week later, a couple driving home from a dance hall saw the same girl walking along the shoulder of Archer Avenue. She looked lost, shivering in the cold, her dress fluttering in the wind. They pulled over, offering her a ride. She accepted without a word, sliding into the back seat with the same quiet grace Daniel had described. The couple tried to talk to her, but she only answered in short, soft phrases, "Just north. It's cold tonight. Almost home." Her voice was gentle, almost musical, but distant, as if she were speaking from another room. When they reached the cemetery, she leaned forward, her breath cold against the driver's ear. "Here." The car slowed. The girl reached for the door. And then she was gone. The couple swore they never saw her open it. They never heard it close. One moment she was sitting behind them, her pale dress glowing faintly in the darkness, and the next, the seat was empty. Stories like these began to spread quietly, whispered in bars, mentioned at family gatherings, shared between friends who didn't want to admit they believed in ghosts. But the details were always the same. A young woman in a pale dress, hitchhiking along Archer Avenue, asking for a ride north, disappearing at the gates of Resurrection Cemetery. Some people saw her standing alone on the roadside, her dress billowing in the wind. Others saw her actually dancing near the old Willowbrook Ballroom, her movements elegant and fluid, as if she were gliding across a floor only she could see. A few claimed they saw her inside the ballroom itself, twirling among the dancers, her pale dress shimmering under the lights before she vanished into thin air. One man swore he saw her run across the road in front of his car. He slammed on the brakes, heart pounding, certain he'd hit her. But when he jumped out to check, the road was empty. No girl, no footprints, no sign of impact, just the cold wind sweeping across the asphalt. Another driver claimed she appeared in his back seat without warning. One moment the car was empty, the next she was sitting behind him, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her eyes fixed on the road ahead. He nearly drove off the shoulder in shock. She didn't speak, she didn't move. She simply stared forward until they reached the cemetery, where she vanished as suddenly as she'd appeared. The stories varied in small ways, but the core remained the same. A girl, a dress, a ride, a disappearance, and always the cemetery. People began to wonder who she was. Some said she was a runaway. Others said she was a girl who'd died in a car accident decades earlier. A few whispered that she was looking for someone, a lost love, a family member, a place she once called home. But the truth, as always, was more complicated. Because the girl in the pale dress wasn't just a ghost story. She was a memory, a tragedy, a legend that refused to fade. And the more people saw her, the more the past began to surface, a past filled with heartbreak, loss, and a night that changed everything. A night that still echoes along Archer Avenue, a night that Resurrection Mary never left. The sightings didn't stop. If anything, they grew more frequent. As if something had shifted along Archer Avenue, as if the boundary between the living and the dead had thinned just enough for her to slip through more often. People who had never believed in ghosts found themselves glancing at the roadside when they drove at night, half expecting to see a pale figure waiting in the cold. And sometimes she was. One night, a taxi driver named Henry was heading south toward the city, his cab rattling over the uneven pavement. He'd been driving that route for years, long enough to know every dip in the road, every flickering streetlight, every stretch where the darkness seemed to swallow the headlights whole. He wasn't afraid of much, not storms, not drunks, not the long, lonely hours. But he never forgot the girl. He saw her standing near the old ballroom, her dress glowing faintly in the yellow light of the street lamp. She looked lost, her arms wrapped around herself, her hair drifting in the wind like strands of gold. Henry slowed the cab, rolling down the window. "You need a ride?" he called out. She nodded, stepping closer. Her movements were smooth, almost too smooth, like she was gliding rather than walking. She opened the door and slid into the back seat, folding her hands neatly in her lap. "Where to?" Henry asked. She didn't answer. She just stared out the window, her expression calm, distant, unreadable. Henry tried again. "You okay back there?" A long pause. Then, softly, "North." He nodded, pulling back onto the road. The cab filled with a strange coldness, the kind that seeped into the bones. Henry turned up the heater, but it didn't help. The girl didn't seem to notice. She just watched the passing trees, the empty fields, the dark stretch of road ahead. When they reached the cemetery gates, she leaned forward, her voice barely above a whisper. "Here." Henry slowed the cab. The girl reached for the door. And then she was gone. The door never opened. The air warmed instantly. The back seat was empty. Henry slammed on the brakes, heart pounding. He twisted around, staring at the seat where she'd been sitting seconds before. Nothing. No footprints, no indentation, no sign she'd ever been there. He didn't tell anyone for weeks, but when he finally did, he learned something that made his blood run cold. He wasn't the first cab driver to pick her up. And he wouldn't be the last. Across town, a group of teenagers had their own encounter. They were driving home from a party, laughing, music blaring, the windows fogged from the cold. Archer Avenue was just a shortcut, a dark, quiet road they barely paid attention to. Until the girl appeared. She stepped into the beam of the headlights so suddenly that the driver swerved, tires screeching against the pavement. The car skidded to a stop, the teens shouting, hearts racing. "What the hell was that? Did you see her dress? Is she hurt?" They piled out of the car, breath steaming in the cold air. The road was empty. The fields were silent. The girl was gone. But the driver swore that she'd looked right at him before disappearing. Her eyes were blue, bright, sad. They got back in the car, shaken, the laughter gone. The music stayed off for the rest of the drive. A week later, one of the teens returned to the spot alone, hoping to prove to himself that it had been a trick of the light, a shadow, a hallucination brought on by exhaustion. He parked near the cemetery, stepping out into the cold night air. The wind rustled the dead leaves. The iron gates loomed in the darkness. The silence pressed in around him. Then he heard the soft rustle of fabric behind him. He turned. She was standing in the middle of the road, her pale dress glowing faintly, her hair drifting in the breeze. She looked exactly as she had that night, young, beautiful, impossibly still. He froze, unable to move. She took one step toward him, then another. Her expression wasn't angry. It wasn't threatening. It was longing, as if she recognized him, as if she wanted to speak, as if she were trying to remember something important. But before she reached him, she stopped. Her gaze shifted toward the cemetery gates. Her expression changed, softened, then faded into something like resignation. She turned away and vanished. The teen ran back to his car, shaking so hard he could barely hold the keys. He didn't return to Archer Avenue for months, but the sightings continued. A woman driving home late at night saw the girl walking along the shoulder, her dress fluttering in the wind. She slowed, rolling down the window. "Do you need help?" The girl turned, her blue eyes shining in the darkness. "I'm trying to get home." She whispered. The woman unlocked the door. The girl climbed in, her presence filling the car with a cold that made the woman's breath fog the windshield. They drove in silence, the girl staring straight ahead. When they reached the cemetery, the girl spoke again. "Thank you." Her voice was soft, sincere, filled with a sadness the woman couldn't explain. The girl stepped out of the car and dissolved into the night. The woman sat there for a long time, staring at the empty road, her heart aching for reasons she couldn't understand. Because that was the thing about Resurrection Mary. She didn't frighten people. She didn't threaten them. She didn't harm anyone. She simply appeared, asked for a ride, and vanished at the gates of the cemetery. But every person who saw her felt the same thing, a strange, lingering sorrow, as if they'd witnessed a tragedy repeating itself over and over, trapped in time. A memory that refused to fade, a girl who never made it home. A story that kept walking Archer Avenue long after the world moved on. And the more people saw her, the more the truth began to surface, a truth buried beneath decades of whispers, rumors, and half-remembered tales. A truth that began on a cold night in the 1930s, a dance hall, a young woman in a pale dress, a drive home that never ended, a night that Resurrection Mary has been reliving ever since. The winter deepened, and with it, the sightings grew stranger. Not more violent. Mary was never violent, but more vivid, more frequent, more impossible to dismiss as tricks of the light or tired eyes on a lonely road. It was as if something in the cold air carried her more easily, as if the long nights gave her more room to walk. People began to notice patterns. She appeared most often on weekends, especially late at night, when the old dance halls emptied and the roads filled with couples heading home. She appeared near the Willowbrook Ballroom, the place where she had once danced, where music had once filled the air, where laughter and footsteps had echoed across the polished floor. Even after the ballroom burned, even after the building was reduced to ashes and memories, people swore they saw her drifting near the ruins, her pale dress glowing faintly in the moonlight. See, Chara ride, pine, tell, wide. One night, a man named Robert was driving past the old site when he saw her standing near the charred remains of the foundation. She looked heartbreakingly out of place, a young woman in a shimmering dress, surrounded by the blackened skeleton of a building that had once been filled with life. She turned her head as he passed, her blue eyes catching the headlights. Robert pulled over without thinking. He stepped out of the car, breath fogging in the cold air. "Are you all right?" he called out. She didn't answer. She simply watched him, her expression soft, almost curious. Then she took a step toward him and the wind shifted, carrying with it the faintest sound of music. Not modern music. Not anything he recognized. It was old-fashioned, slow, the kind of melody people danced to in the 1930s. The girl lifted her hands slightly, as if inviting him to dance. Robert froze. His heart hammered in his chest. The music grew louder, swirling around him like a memory brought to life. He took one hesitant step forward, and then the music stopped. The girl's expression changed, the curiosity fading, replaced by something like sorrow. She lowered her hand, turned away, and walked toward the road. Robert blinked, and she was gone. He stood there for a long time, listening to the silence, wondering if he had imagined the music. But the cold in the air felt too real, too heavy, too full of something he couldn't explain. Another night, a police officer patrolling Archer Avenue spotted a young woman walking along the shoulder, barefoot, her dress fluttering in the wind. Concerned she might be injured, he pulled over and approached her. "Ma'am, are you okay?" She didn't respond. She kept walking, her steps slow and deliberate, her gaze fixed on the road ahead. The officer followed beside her, trying again. "Do you need help? Do you live nearby?" Still nothing. He reached out gently to touch her shoulder. His hand passed straight through her. The officer stumbled backward, heart slamming against his ribs. The girl continued walking, completely unfazed, her form shimmering faintly in the moonlight. She reached the cemetery gates, paused for a moment, and then dissolved into the darkness like mist. The officer never filed a report. But he told his partner, and his partner told his brother, and soon the story spread, joining the growing collection of encounters that all pointed to the same impossible truth. Mary was real. And she was still walking, but not all sightings were so quiet. One night, a young couple was driving home after a late dinner, the radio playing softly, the heater humming. They were laughing about something trivial when the girl in the passenger seat suddenly gasped. "Stop the car." The driver slammed on the brakes, confused. What's wrong?" She pointed ahead, her hand trembling. A girl in a pale dress was standing in the middle of the road, her hair drifting in the wind, her eyes fixed on the couple's car. The headlights illuminated her completely, the shimmer of her dress, the delicate curve of her shoulders, the sadness in her expression. The driver honked the horn, expecting her to move. She didn't. He honked again. She didn't flinch. The couple exchanged a terrified glance. The driver slowly eased the car forward, intending to go around her. But as they approached, the girl stepped toward the vehicle not aggressively, not threateningly, but with a strange, desperate urgency, as if she needed something from them. The couple froze, unsure what to do. Then, without warning, the girl vanished. Not faded, not stepped aside, vanished. The couple sat in stunned silence, the car idling in the middle of the road. The girl in the passenger seat whispered, "Did you see her eyes?" The driver nodded slowly. "Yeah." They looked sad. He didn't disagree. Because that was the thing about resurrection, Mary. She wasn't frightening. She wasn't angry. She wasn't malicious. She was sad. Every person who saw her felt it, a deep, aching sorrow that lingered long after the encounter ended. A sense that she was searching for something she could never quite reach. A longing that stretched across decades, pulling her back to the same road, the same gates, the same unfinished journey. And then came the sighting that changed everything. A man named Thomas was driving home late one night, the road empty, the sky clear. He wasn't thinking about ghosts. He wasn't thinking about anything except getting home and going to bed. Then he saw her. She was standing near the cemetery gates, her dress glowing faintly in the moonlight. But this time, she wasn't alone. A second figure stood beside her, tall, shadowy, indistinct. Not glowing, not shimmering. Just there, watching. Mary turned her head toward Thomas, her blue eyes catching the headlights. The shadowy figure turned too, though its face remained hidden in darkness. Thomas slammed on the brakes, heart pounding. The two figures stood perfectly still, side by side, as if waiting for something. Then Mary stepped forward. The shadow did not. She walked toward the road, her expression soft, pleading, filled with a sadness that made Thomas's chest tighten. She reached out a hand not to him, but toward the road itself, as if asking for help, or permission, or release. The shadowy figure remained by the gate, unmoving. Mary took one more step, and vanished. The shadow vanished with her. Thomas drove home shaking, unable to explain what he'd seen, but he knew one thing for certain. Mary wasn't wandering aimlessly. She wasn't lost. She wasn't confused. She was trying to get somewhere, trying to finish something, trying to return to a place she never reached. And the closer people looked, the clearer the truth became. Mary wasn't just a ghost. She was a story frozen in time, a tragedy replaying itself over and over along Archer Avenue. A girl who left a dance hall one night in the 1930s. A girl who never made it home. A girl whose final steps still echo along the road. A girl who walks because she never stopped. By the time the sightings reached their peak, the legend of resurrection, Mary had already taken on a life of its own. But behind every ghost story, behind every whispered encounter on Archer Avenue, there is a real history, a real place, and most haunting of all, a real person. To understand Mary, you have to understand Chicago in the early 20th century. Archer Avenue wasn't just a lonely stretch of road back then, it was a lifeline between neighborhoods, dance halls, taverns, and the sprawling cemeteries that lined the outskirts of the city. Young people flocked to the Willowbrook Ballroom, then known as the O. Henry Ballroom, to dance, socialize, and escape the weight of the Great Depression for a few hours. It was a place of music, laughter, and possibility. And it was the last place Mary was ever seen alive. The most widely accepted version of the story begins in the early 1930s. A young woman, blonde, blue-eyed, wearing a pale dress, attended a dance at the ballroom. Witnesses described her as quiet but friendly, graceful on the dance floor, and dressed more elegantly than most. Some said she came with friends. Others said she arrived alone. But everyone agreed on one thing. She left before the night was over. Some say she argued with her date. Some say she felt unwell. Some say she simply wanted to go home. What happened next is where the legend begins to blur into tragedy. The story goes that Mary left the ballroom and began walking north along Archer Avenue, heading toward her home. It was late. The night was cold. Cars were few and far between. Somewhere along that dark stretch of road, she was struck by a passing vehicle, a hit-and-run that left her fatally injured. The driver never stopped. Mary never made it home. Her body was found the next morning near the gates of Resurrection Cemetery. She was buried in a white dress. The same dress people claim to see her wearing today. But who was she? That question has fueled decades of research, speculation, and investigation. Several real women have been proposed as the true Resurrection Mary, each with details that align eerily well with the legend. One of the strongest candidates is Mary Bregovy, a young woman who died in a car accident in 1934. She was blonde, blue-eyed, and known to frequent dance halls. Her death certificate lists injuries consistent with a violent collision. She was buried in Resurrection Cemetery. Another possibility is Anna Marie Norkus, who died in 1927, at the age of 12, too young to match the sightings. But her family insisted she looked older, and often dressed up for dances. She too is buried in Resurrection Cemetery. There are others, young women who died tragically, suddenly, violently, all buried within the same cemetery whose gates Mary is forever drawn to. But none of the theories have ever been proven. The truth remains elusive, hidden beneath decades of folklore and fading records. What makes the legend so compelling is not just the tragedy, but the consistency of the sightings. They began in the 1930s, and have continued ever since, spanning generations, evolving with the city itself. Cab drivers, police officers, teenagers, couples, and even entire groups of people have reported seeing her. The details rarely change. A pale dress, blonde hair, blue eyes. A quiet voice, a request for a ride north, a disappearance at the cemetery gates. Some sightings include physical interaction, doors opening, seats shifting, cold air filling the car. Others involve Mary passing through solid objects, vanishing in headlights, or appearing inside vehicles without explanation. One of the most famous incidents occurred in the 1970s, when a driver claimed Mary grabbed the door handle of his car, leaving behind a handprint that remained visible even after he wiped the glass. Another involved a man who said Mary guided his steering wheel to avoid a collision, saving his life before disappearing. But the most chilling evidence came from the cemetery itself. In the 1970s, workers discovered 2 iron bars on the cemetery gate that appeared to have been bent apart by an enormous force. Embedded in the metal were what looked like handprints, small, delicate, unmistakably human. The bars were removed shortly afterward, but not before photographs were taken. To this day, those photos remain some of the most debated pieces of paranormal evidence in Chicago history. Skeptics argue the bars were damaged by machinery. Believers insist the marks were Mary's. The truth lies somewhere in the space between. What makes Resurrection Mary unique among ghost legends is her behavior. She is not malevolent. She does not harm. She does not frighten intentionally. She does not seek revenge. She simply reenacts the final moments of her life, walking the road, seeking a ride, returning to the place where her journey ended. In many ways, she is a residual haunting, a memory imprinted on the landscape, replaying endlessly. But there are elements of her story that suggest something more intelligent, more aware. She responds to drivers. She speaks. She gestures. She interacts with the environment in ways residual hauntings do not. Some paranormal researchers believe Mary is a hybrid haunting, part residual, part intelligent. A spirit caught between worlds, repeating her final steps, but still aware enough to seek help, to communicate, to reach out. Others believe she is a symbol, a manifestation of collective memory, the embodiment of every young life cut short, every tragedy along Archer Avenue, every story whispered in the dark. And then there are those who believe Mary is not alone. Over the years, a handful of witnesses have reported seeing other figures near the cemetery's shadowy shapes, indistinct forms, silhouettes that vanish when approached. Some say these are other spirits buried in Resurrection Cemetery. Others say they are guardians, watching over Mary, guiding her, ensuring she never strays too far from the place she is bound to. Whatever the truth, one thing is certain. Mary walks Archer Avenue because she never stopped. Her story is not just a haunting, it is a reminder. A reminder of a night long ago. A reminder of a life interrupted. A reminder that some tragedies echo far beyond their time. And as long as people drive that lonely stretch of road, as long as the wind rustles the dead leaves along the cemetery gates, as long as the memory of that night lingers, Mary will. Searching, returning, reaching for a home she never reached. Even after nearly a century of sightings, Resurrection Mary remains one of the most persistent, consistent, and culturally powerful ghost legends in the United States. What makes her story so enduring isn't just the tragedy behind it, though that alone is enough to leave an imprint on the landscape. It's the way her presence has woven itself into the identity of Chicago's South Side, becoming a part of the city's folklore, its history, and its collective memory. Ask anyone who grew up near Archer Avenue and they'll tell you the same thing. Mary isn't just a story, she's a landmark. People don't talk about her like a myth. They talk about her like a neighbor, someone who's always been there, walking the same stretch of road, appearing in the same places, following the same path night after night. She's as much a part of the area as the cemeteries, the taverns, the old dance halls, and the long, lonely road that ties them all together. And that's what makes her so unique. Most ghost stories fade over time. Mary hasn't. If anything, she's become more real. Part of that is because her story is rooted in something tangible, a real road, a real cemetery, a real ballroom, a real tragedy. People can drive the same route she walked. They can stand at the gates where she disappears. They can visit the graves of the women believed to be her. The physical world and the legend overlap so perfectly that it becomes difficult to separate the two. But there's something else at play, something deeper, something psychological. Mary's story resonates because it taps into universal fears and universal emotions. The fear of dying young, the fear of being forgotten, the fear of being trapped in a moment that never ends, the longing for home, the longing for closure, the longing for a final destination that remains forever out of reach. People see Mary not as a monster, but as a symbol, a reminder of fragility, of fate, of the thin line between life and death. She is the embodiment of unfinished business, of a journey interrupted, of a life cut short. And in that way, she becomes more than a ghost. She becomes a mirror. But even with all the symbolism, all the psychology, all the cultural weight, there remains one undeniable fact. People still see her. Not in the past. Not in old newspaper clippings. Not in stories passed down from grandparents. Now. Today. In the present, drivers still report picking up a young woman in a pale dress. Cab drivers still swear she vanishes from their back seat. Teens still see her walking along the shoulder of the road. Locals still avoid Archer Avenue late at night. And every so often, someone claims to see her actually dancing near the ruins of the old ballroom, as if the music never stopped for her. Modern sightings are just as vivid as the ones from the 1930s. The details haven't changed. The behavior hasn't changed. The sadness hasn't changed. If anything, the consistency makes the legend harder to dismiss. Psychologists argue that Mary is a product of expectation, that people who know the story are more likely to interpret shadows or reflections as something supernatural. They point to the power of suggestion, the way the mind fills in gaps, the way fear shapes perception. But that explanation falls apart when confronted with the sheer number of witnesses who had never heard of Mary before seeing her. Tourists, new residents, out-of-state drivers. People with no cultural context, no expectations, no reason to imagine a ghost on a cold Chicago road. And then there are the physical interactions: the doors opening, the seats shifting, the cold air filling the car. These are not hallucinations. These are tactile experiences, shared by people who have nothing in common except the road they were driving on. Paranormal researchers classify Mary as a vanishing hitchhiker, one of the most common ghost archetypes in the world. But even among those stories, Mary stands apart. Most vanishing hitchhikers appear once, maybe twice, then faded into obscurity. Mary has been appearing for nearly a century, with no sign of stopping. Some believe she is a spirit bound to the place where she died, unable to move on because her final moments were filled with fear, confusion, and pain. Others believe she is searching for someone: the driver who hit her, the date she left behind, the family she never returned to. Some say she is trying to get home, repeating the journey she never completed. And then there are those who believe Mary is not trapped at all, that she chooses to walk, chooses to appear, chooses to remind the living of the fragility of life and the weight of memory. Whatever the truth, Mary has become more than a ghost. She has become a cultural icon, a symbol of Chicago's haunted history, a story told in documentaries, books, radio shows, and late-night conversations. She has inspired songs, films, and countless retellings. Her legend has crossed state lines, becoming one of the most famous ghost stories in America. But for the people who have seen her, truly seen her, the legend is not entertainment. It is not folklore. It is not a story to tell around a campfire. It is a moment they can't forget, a moment when the past stepped into the present, a moment when the cold air inside the car felt too real, a moment when a girl in a pale dress looked at them with eyes full of sorrow, a moment when the world felt thinner, older, heavier, a moment when they realized that some tragedies never fade, and that is why Resurrection Mary endures. Not because she is frightening, not because she is dangerous, not because she is a ghost, but because she is human. A young woman who never made it home, a memory that refuses to die, a story that keeps walking Archer Avenue long after the world moved on. And as long as the road remains, as long as the cemetery gates stand, as long as the wind rustles, the dead leaves along the fence, as long as people drive that lonely stretch at Lonely Night, Mary will be there, walking, waiting, searching, returning, a pale figure in the darkness, a shimmer of moonlight on silk, a soft voice asking for a ride north, a final journey that never ends. Resurrection Mary, Chicago's eternal hitchhiker, a legend carved into the asphalt of Archer Avenue. A ghost who never stopped walking home. If you made it all the way through Mary's story, thank you for walking that long, cold stretch of Archer Avenue with me. Legends like this don't survive for nearly a century unless something in them still breathes, still moves, still waits in the dark. If this deep dive into Resurrection Mary kept you watching, go ahead and hit that like button. It helps this channel more than you know. And if you want more stories like this, more hauntings, more folklore, more encounters that blur the line between history and the supernatural, make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss the next journey into the unknown. Have you ever driven Archer Avenue at night? Do you know someone who has seen her? Drop your thoughts or your own stories in the comments. I read every single one. Thanks for watching. Stay safe out there. And if you're ever driving alone past Resurrection Cemetery and you see a girl in a pale dress walking in the cold, don't be surprised.